You ever hear of a gunfighter so slippery that he was able to dodge bullets, murder charges, and possibly even gravity itself? Meet mysterious Dave Mather, part outlaw, part lawman, and total question mark. Mather may have ran with the likes of Wyatt Earp and Dirty Dave Rudaball, but at the very peak of his infamy, he simply vanished. No grave, no body, no final dramatic shootout, nothing. He was just gone. The only question is where. How true are the stories about Dave fleeing to Canada and becoming a Mountie? What about the rumors that he was killed by moonshiners in Tennessee, or that he reinvented himself out west in California? Or did something far stranger catch up with him? Something otherworldly, perhaps. And yeah, I am referring to little green men from outer space. Buckle up, because this one is definitely gonna get weird. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. David Allen Mather was born on August 10th, 1851, in what's now known as Deep River, Connecticut. And for those of you looking for a thorough rundown of Dave's early life, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's just not a lot out there. Story goes that Dave's father, Ulysses, abandoned the family in 1856 to become a ship captain, which in hindsight may not have been all that great of a decision, as he was murdered by his own crew in 1864. Sadly, Dave's mother, Lydia, would also die before he reached adulthood. By 1860, he was living with his maternal grandfather, and by 1870, an either 18 or 19-year-old Mather could be found on the federal census living in Westbrook, Connecticut, employed as a laborer. It wasn't until later on in that same year that he and his little brother Josiah followed in their daddy's footsteps and took to sailing the high seas. Just not for very long. As soon as their cargo ship docked in New Orleans, the boys headed inland. And that's where things start to get really mysterious. For the next few years, we really don't have any idea what Dave was up to. There are rumors, though. Boy, howdy are there. Mostly unsubstantiated stories claiming that he did everything from hunting bison on the Kansas prairie to rustling cattle with Dave Rudaball over in Arkansas. Now, there's even an unverified report of him running a con game down in Texas with none other than Wyatt Earp. About the closest I can find to an actual verified mention comes from a Dodge City newspaper in 1879, which named him as a regular associate of the notorious horse thief Dutch Henry Bourne. So yeah, as you can see, there's about a decade there where we honestly don't really know what mysterious Dave Mather was up to. What we know for certain, though, is that by the late 1870s, he was running with the Dodge City gang down in Las Vegas, New Mexico. East Las Vegas, New Mexico, to be exact. Now, if you're a longtime listener, you've heard me mention these guys many times in the past. But for those of you who are new, the Dodge City Gang was essentially just a loose network of gamblers, saloon owners, and gunmen led by an old boy by the name of Hyman Neal, aka Hoodoo Brown. In fact, Hoodoo, in addition to serving as mayor of East Las Vegas, was also the town coroner, the justice of the peace, and even the chief constable. His deputies included such Old West luminaries as Dirty Dave Rudaball, Tom Pickett, Joe Carson, J.J. Webb, and yeah, even our very own mysterious Dave Mather. I keep wanting to call him Mathers, but I'm pretty sure he's not related to Eminem, so I'll try to rein that in. By the way, a lot of these guys had been previously acquainted back in Dodge City, hence the name, the Dodge City Gang. So I do think it's likely that mysterious Dave also spent time in Dodge before drifting south. It's also worth noting that these guys were just a little bit on the crooked side. Hell, Rudaball and Joe Carson would even rob a stagecoach outside of Vegas in August 1879. A crime that was ultimately pinned on 3 innocent men. They would occasionally do real honest-to-God police work, though. Like in late January of 1880, when Dave and Carson responded to a disturbance over at the Close and Patterson Variety Hall. Per historian David G. Thomas, quote, on January 22nd, 4 Texas Panhandle cowboys, Tom Dutch Henry, James West, William Tom Randall, and Jim Loco Dorsey, rode into Las Vegas with the intention of settling a score with Las Vegas Constable Joe Carson. A week earlier, Carson had questioned the men about stealing a 2-horse buggy, for which there was an enticing $500 reward. He was driven off with harsh words. About 11 p.m., the 4 men entered the Close and Patterson's late-night dance hall, belligerently drunk and heavily armed. End of quote. When mysterious Dave finally arrived on the scene, he requested that the cowboys check their sidearms with the bartender. They refused and began hurling insults at him. They then turned their attention to Deputy Carson, saying that no man could make them give up their pistols. Then, without warning, Tom Henry shucked iron and put a bullet in Carson's left arm. Mysterious Dave responded by shooting Henry, at which point all hell broke loose. According to a local paper, the lamps in the dance hall were extinguished by the repeated concussions, and then followed a scene that beggars description. At least 30 shots were fired almost simultaneously, the leaden missiles of death flying as thick as hailstones around the crowded room. And yeah, when the smoke cleared, Joe Carson was dead, and Randall lay mortally wounded. His buddy James West was likewise wounded, and apparently in all the chaos, the other two cowpokes, Henry and Dorsey, were able to escape. As for Mather, he proved to be just as lucky as he was mysterious. Whereas Carson had been riddled with no less than 8 bullets, Dave had received nothing more than a grazing wound. Well, just 3 days later, on January 25th, he would kill yet again. This time a guy by the name of Joseph Costello, a railroad foreman who had made the grave mistake of going for his pistol during an argument. Luckily for Dave, a coroner's jury would rule the killing as self-defense. Imagine that. Now, be that as it may, the good citizens of East Las Vegas were very quickly growing weary of Mather and his associates. The following month, those two guys who escaped that gunfight, Henry and Dorsey, they were apprehended and thrown in the same jail as their wounded compadre, James West. And a couple of nights after that is when the vigilantes came a-calling. The prisoners were taken to the town square, where one of them was lynched from the windmill. The other two were forced to stand on said windmill, as, according to the paper out of Santa Fe, they were quote-unquote perforated with bullets. Bullets that were allegedly fired by Joe Carson's widow. Now, we don't know whether or not Dave Mather took part in these unsanctioned killings, but considering his friendship with Carson and his position as constable, I'm willing to bet that at the very least he turned a blind eye. Skip ahead to early March, and another Vegas deputy, J.J. Webb, shot and killed a freighter named Michael Kelleher. Per the March 9th, 1880 edition of the Dodge City Globe, quote, at about 4 a.m., 3 men, headed by Michael Kelleher, entered the Goodlet and Robert Saloon. All being intoxicated and heavily armed, they soon became very boisterous. Police Officer Webb, being present and fearing that trouble would arise, ordered them to depart. Kelleher refused, exclaiming, "I won't be disarmed." He drew his pistol and was just in the act of leveling the weapon when Webb, taking in the situation at once, and quick as a wink, pulled his pistol and instantly fired a ball into his chest. Kelleher dropped to his side but still showed fight. The officer fired twice more, balls lodging in the breast and head. Kelleher dropped over on the floor and died without speaking. End of quote. And yeah, that's the official story, but things may have been a tad bit more complicated than reported. You see, the victim, Michael Kelleher, had just finished driving a load of freight all the way from South Dakota and had over $2,000 on his person, which, adjusted for inflation, is close to $64,000 in today's money. Just so happens that Dirty Dave Rudaball was also in the saloon when Kelleher was killed, as was the mayor/coroner, Hoodoo Brown. And surprise, surprise, according to both Dave and Brown, the killing was justifiable. And to be honest, that might be true. I mean, there are people even to this day who do think that Webb was justified. Others, however, maintain that he assassinated Kelleher on orders from Hoodoo. Matter of fact, Hoodoo would actually skip town shortly thereafter with the money that they took off of Kelleher's body. Wasn't long before a judge put 2 and 2 together and had Webb arrested and charged with murder. That was in early March of 1880, okay? A month later, Rudaball and one of his buddies gunned down a respected jailer while attempting to bust Webb out of the clink. A senseless killing that proved to be the last straw for the good folks of East Las Vegas. They soon formed a vigilance committee and put what remained of the Dodge City gang on notice. Rather than stick around and wait on a hangman's noose, Mysterious Dave wisely chose to try his luck in a more agreeable climate. And by a more agreeable climate, I do mean Dodge City, Kansas. Just in time for the Dodge City War. Now, this so-called war is nowhere near as exciting as the name suggests. In all reality, it was just a highly publicized standoff between the mayor, Larry Degger, and a gambler by the name of Luke Short. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about some of these people I'm naming, I do have a full episode on Dave Rudaball, and I also have an entire episode devoted to Luke Short and the Dodge City War. I'll drop some links down below if you're curious. But basically, Degger was just trying to force Short out of town. So in turn, Luke assembled a team of badasses, including Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and former sheriff Charlie Bassett. With support from the governor of Kansas and growing pressure from economic powerhouses like the Santa Fe Railroad, both sides were eventually able to resolve their differences, and Luke Short's Long Branch Saloon was allowed to reopen. The entire ordeal proved completely bloodless, but the presence of so many noted gunmen did make the citizens of Dodge somewhat nervous, which may have been how Mather landed the job as assistant marshal in the first place. I didn't mention that yet, did I? Yeah, so when he got to town, he was made assistant marshal, a position that he would only hold for a very short amount of time. There would be another election shortly thereafter, and the new mayor appointed the legendary Bill Tillman as the new town marshal. He also replaced Mysterious Dave with a former buffalo hunter named Tom Nixon. In other words, Mather was out of a job. Kind of. I mean, he was still a deputy sheriff for Ford County at the same time, and the following month, after he lost his position as assistant marshal, he purchased the Opera House Saloon with his buddy, David Black. So it's not like he was destitute or anything, but he did seem to harbor a grudge against his replacement, Tom Nixon. More on Tom in just a moment. In the meantime, Mather busied himself renovating the saloon into a dance hall. Or at least he did until the city council ordered him to stop. They even passed an ordinance outlawing, quote, what is commonly known as a dance hall, or any other place where lewd women and men congregate with the purpose of dancing or otherwise, end of quote. Otherwise doing a lot of work there. Only problem was the ordinance wasn't being fairly enforced. In fact, Dave's rival, the aforementioned Tom Nixon, also owned a dance hall known as the Lady Gay. Now, whereas Dave's joint was effectively put out of business, Nixon was allowed to continue hosting dancing gals with zero repercussions. Whether or not this was a deliberate favoritism or just selective enforcement is unclear, but it certainly did add fuel to an already simmering fire. So Mather fought back by lowering the price of beer to just 5 cents a glass, less than half of what the Lady Gay was charging. In turn, Nixon and the other saloon owners retaliated by pressuring wholesalers to cut off Mather's supply of beer. And just to further aggravate matters, evidence suggests that Mysterious Dave may have had the hots for Nixon's wife, Cornelia. Not sure how true that is, but I do know that things finally came to a head on the evening of July 18th, 1884. Dave was standing on the steps in front of his saloon when all of a sudden Nixon walked up and opened fire. Keep in mind that Nixon is acting assistant marshal at this point, and he just walks up and tries to murder a dude. Per the July 19th edition of the Dodge City Democrat, quote, the bullet went wild and struck the woodwork of the porch. Mather's face was considerably powder burned, and the little finger of his left hand was injured by a splinter, end of quote. Telling you, this dude was more lucky than he was mysterious. They should have called his ass Lucky Dave Mather. Now, Bill Tillman's wife Zoe would later remark somewhat prophetically that when it comes to a man like Dave Mather, you better shoot straight or not at all, because if you miss, he will get you. And sure enough, Tom Nixon got. Killing occurred just a few nights later as Nixon was making his rounds. Dave waited until the lawman was walking by and then called out his name. And then, according to the papers, quote, as Nixon turned around, Mather commenced shooting at him, firing 4 shots, killing him instantly. An eyewitness would later state that Dave told Nixon that he had lived long enough before finishing him off. And upon being arrested, he claimed that his only regret was not killing him 6 months earlier. No word on whether or not he was able to hook up with Cornelia. Now, Dave would be tried for murder, but this tends to be the case with these types of Old West shootouts. He was ultimately acquitted. You know, people have this idea of the Old West being very hard on crime, and I am here to tell you, after spending years researching this stuff, as long as you didn't fall prey to a lynch mob, and you actually made it to trial, 9 times out of 10, you were going to get acquitted. And Mysterious Dave Mather was no different. Of course, it didn't hurt matters none that the sheriff testified on his behalf. So did Bat Masterson. Apparently, the locals were on his side as well, as the Dodge City Times would report that the courtroom broke out into applause when Mather received his acquittal. He wouldn't remain a free man for very long, though. He was soon joined there in Dodge by his little brother, Josiah. And in May of 1885, they got into a shooting scrape over at the Junction Saloon. Details are a little sketchy, but Dave and a gambler named Barnes got into an argument over a game of 7-Up. One thing led to another. Some sources claimed that Mather attempted to steal the pot, and when Barnes complained, Dave punched him in the face. And that's when Barnes went for his pistol. And once the smoke cleared, Barnes was dead, and 2 bystanders were wounded. Dave was arrested yet again, but oddly enough, his pistol was found to be fully loaded, indicating that while he may have started the fight, he didn't actually take part in the shooting. Nevertheless, both he and his brother Josiah were charged with murder. The pair were able to post bond just a few weeks later, on July 29th, after which they promptly got the hell out of Dodge. And this is where things really start to get mysterious. We know that the brothers eventually split up shortly after leaving Dodge. Josiah would go to Utah and then Idaho, where he would continue living all the way until his death in 1932. Dave would make a brief stop in Topeka before taking a job as a city marshal in the town of New Kiowa, Kansas. Or at least that's what the Dodge City Times reported in August of 1885. Truth is, Mather did pay a visit to New Kiowa with his old saloon partner, David Black, but he was definitely not appointed as marshal. In fact, they were only in town for a few days before Black was forced to flee after killing a soldier. A lynch mob was formed, and after they failed to locate Black, they turned their attention on Mather, who likewise chose to haul ass. And that was it. That was the last, for sure, verified sighting of mysterious Dave Mather. To this day, nobody knows for certain what became of him. One of the earliest rumors regarding his fate comes from Dallas, Texas in 1886. That's when reports surfaced of an unidentified man's body being located next to the railroad tracks, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Worth noting that no official record exists tying the body to Mather. Okay, I just want to make that clear. The alleged identification seems to have been based entirely on gossip. Another popular theory is that Dave drifted north and joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This particular story seems to originate in an article published in Everybody's Magazine in 1902, written by Edward Little. According to Little, Mather not only joined the Mounties, but he also robbed a stagecoach that he'd been assigned to protect. And once he was found out, he pulled yet another disappearing act. There's just one catch, though. The Mounties were pretty damn meticulous when it came to keeping records, and there is not a single reference to a David Mather ever serving with them. I suppose he could have enlisted under an alias. That's always possible. But at the same time, you have to consider the source. Little's reporting was based entirely on hearsay. But then again, there was another story that surfaced in the 1950s, alleging that Dave was serving with the Mounties as late as 1921. So who knows, there may be a kernel of truth in there, but once again, there is no actual proof. One of the more believable stories comes out of Long Pine, Nebraska in 1887, just a couple of years after he disappeared. Numerous people who had allegedly known Dave from Dodge City claimed to have seen him living there in Nebraska. Others claim that Dave moved to California, where he started committing crimes under the alias of Dave Taylor, while others maintain that he retired as a U.S. Customs officer up in Washington State. His brother Josiah would later say that he was killed by moonshiners in the mountains of Tennessee, but at the same time, he told his children that he never saw Dave again after they parted company in Kansas. Now, my absolute favorite theory out of all of them is the one about him being abducted by aliens. And I'm not making this up, by the way. This is a real story, kind of. I mean, it's a story that I didn't make up, at least. Okay, so it first appeared in the Frontier Times magazine in 1963 and was quickly picked up by tabloids nationwide. According to the legend, Dave was hunting down cattle rustlers in northern Mexico in 1889 when he and his posse encountered what they described as a silver bowl in the sky. One of the members of the posse, a then teenager named Jorge Hernandez, would later claim on his deathbed that the UFO stayed just ahead of him, darting back and forth across the sky in spurts. And then when the group split up to investigate, Dave went down a canyon alone. And he never came out. The strange craft was then seen rising into the sky and vanished. The posse was able to locate Mather's horse, fully saddled and seemingly agitated, but there was absolutely zero sign of Dave. No footprints, no blood, nothing. They even had an indigenous tracker with them, who allegedly muttered, Pueblo de Cielo, or Cielo, whatever the fuck, Spanish for sky people, basically. And then he rode away and refused to ever speak of it again. Needless to say, there is no contemporary record of this ever happening, okay? The story didn't appear until decades later, and it was almost certainly born from someone's very active imagination. But damn it sure is fun to think about. Look, at the end of the day, nobody can say for certain what happened to mysterious Dave Mather. And in a way, I do think that's fitting, especially considering his nickname. But you tell me, what do you think? Was Dave really killed in Texas? Did he serve with the Mounties up in Canada? Or did he reinvent himself anew in California or Washington State? Hit me up at Josh at Wild West Extra or drop a comment down below. I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Who knows, maybe the alien story is true and Dave is still out there somewhere, living in a galaxy far, far away. Maybe he's flying a starship across the universe divide. And maybe when he reaches the other side, he'll find a place to rest his spirit if he can. And perhaps he'll even become a highwayman again. Or hear me out, maybe Dave will become a single drop of rain. Whatever the case, I do think he will remain. And he'll be back again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And so will I, next week, with more true tells from the Wild West. Until then, be nice to one another, and adios.